Good evening, lovely people. I am Neil Oliver and I was live the last time I looked. I'm on GB News TV and on the radio. Our first guest this evening will be Canadian trucker and commentator Gord McGill, who joins me to talk about the case of 4 Canadian political prisoners in Canada, who became known as the Coots 4, jailed for more than 700 days without bail or process. I'll then be joined by Canadian journalist David Craden to discuss Trudeau's Online Harms Act. Sounds familiar? And finally, I'll be telling you about my new show, where I'll be splitting my time between an online 2-hour show on a Friday evening, as well as a new show which will be on your screens on Sunday evenings from 6 p.m. All exciting stuff. All of that in the company of my panellist, presenter and friend, the wonderful Andrew Eborn. I am joined now by lawyer, futurist, broadcaster, all-round smarty pants, friend of the show, Andrew Eborn. Andrew, an unelected Prime Minister makes a speech decrying a candidate who got in by a majority vote, calling that a threat to democracy. Yeah. Is that an unedifying spectacle?
It's crazy. First of all, I have to say, it's probably one of the best speeches that Rishi's made. And a lot of people have sort of said this is what sort of happened. It's interesting, as soon as you get the podium out there, you all assume he's going to call an election, which obviously didn't happen. But a number of points on it. Firstly, you can't say it's undemocratic when a democracy voted in a candidate. You can't label somebody as extremist just because they got an alternative view to you. We have to have an environment where we question everything. And as soon as you stifle debate, that's when you start having problems, because we need to make informed decisions. We're surrounded in a diseased information world where a lot of the information that we're getting is false. Everybody's suddenly become an expert, whether it's a virologist or it's going to be somebody about constitution and so on and so forth. And that's what we need to do, is find the experts, get those legitimate questions answered, because without that, there's not a proper debate.
I called his behaviour yesterday gaslighting. Do you think that's justified? Because, as I saw it, all sorts of problems are out there in the world and in this country. And yet again, a Prime Minister, a politician, their first move is to blame the people. Yeah. Some of the people, divide the people, set one group against another.
And it's very difficult, as I say, because you can't shut down debate. And I think come together doesn't mean you have to have the same opinion. A healthy democracy depends on a healthy debate and informed decisions. And as soon as you shut down that debate, that's when the problems arise. But I think there's some legitimate points. I mean, politicians now are so scared that some of them are, people have already been murdered, some people are not standing again because they fear for their life. That is wrong. So when you're talking about the side of law, you have to absolutely abide with in the law. You've got it's a freedom of speech, but it's not freedom from consequences. But there is a difference between that and a legitimate debate.
But that, well, let's call it recklessness, for years, where the contents of Westminster felt able and justified in taking away one freedom after another, in one way or another destroying or ending uncounted numbers of lives. What on earth possessed them to think that they could operate in that way with impunity, without eventually, one way or another, ending up facing angry people? Yeah.
Well, again, you've got to ask, well, why would they do it? And they will always say, in their defence, they're trying to follow the science, that it's not their fault, this is what the scientists told them to do, because that's the safest thing. You have to lock people up to prevent the spread of COVID and so on and so forth.
We know now that that was all nonsense. So that was all nonsense. They were pushing nonsense, and they knew they were pushing nonsense. And furthermore, they were pushing gene therapies as vaccines when there was no safety evidence relating to those products.
So the real question, as I say, question everything. We must be entitled to question everything. Why would they do that?
Well, why would they do that? I mean, I would say the whole thing was always predicated upon control, predicated upon power, shortening the leash, in fact, setting in train a sequence of events that had possibly been in the pipeline for decades. And whatever it was, whether it was Brexit, whether it was Trump, whether it was something else, a decision was taken to pull the trigger and get everyone back in their box. And now that box has exploded on them.
Yeah, it's interesting because politicians are in the business of getting re-elected. So it's very short term for a lot of things. You have to have these policies to make sure you're re-elected in the next 4 years, but you still need to address those fundamental issues. And I think you're right, we should continue questioning everything, shine more light and less heat on these issues and get those answers.
Question everything. It's a break already, after which I'll be joined by a Canadian trucker, Gord McGill, to talk about why 4 peace protesters who took part in the truckers' convoy were arrested, refused bail and left to languish in jail for more than 700 days. Don't go away.
Like, what does this say about your right to protest, your right to freedom of speech, if the government can pick you up at a totally peaceful protest, concoct a fantasy against you, put you in jail for 2 years, deny you bail, not even get the trial underway, and then at the end of it all just say, oh, well, sorry about that, we're going to drop the charges now. Like, what right to protest do you actually have?
Now, you mentioned the Emergency Act, which was so controversially brought down by Trudeau's government. I'm right in saying, am I not, that a federal court has since described the invocation of that act in those circumstances as illegal anyway?
Correct. A federal judge ruled that Justin Trudeau had in fact illegally taken away the rights, the charter-protected rights of a couple of people who launched challenges against it, and did in fact rule that it was illegal. And what do you know? Like, I think it only took 17 minutes for Trudeau's deputy, Chrystia Freeland, and some of his other underlings to launch an appeal. Like, they didn't even have the time to read the nearly 200 pages of that ruling. They just appealed it immediately without even considering the fact that they may have been wrong.
Andrew Eborn, you're a lawyer. You're listening to that. How does that sequence of events strike?
Well, it's abhorrent that people can have their liberty taken away without any substantial evidence against them. The whole idea of the rule of law is that you should protect everybody, and it's about that sort of side. When you hear about these sort of cases, 700 days taken away from their family, put in solitary confinement, denied all sorts of human rights as a result of it, that's abhorrent, and it must never happen again. We've had very recently a number of examples, like here in the post office, same sort of thing, people taken away, wrongly charged, having to basically plea deal, if you like, in order to get reduced sentences or whatever. Now, that is wrong, and it shouldn't be happening anywhere in the world.
Gord McGill, is there any sign of consequences? You know, there's the government, the Canadian government, found to have acted illegally in bringing down the Emergency Act in the way that it did. People accused of egregious crimes without any evidence brought forward so far, 2 of whom have been released with all charges dropped. There's a mounting list. You know, the bona fide Nazi veteran given a standing ovation in the Canadian Parliament. Is any of that rap sheet looking like having any sort of consequences for the people responsible?
No, and they call our Prime Minister Teflon Trudeau for a reason. You know, he's the darling of the Laurentian elite who really run the country. And Trudeau has done an amazing job at insulating himself from any legitimate or substantial critique in the media. We have to remember that the mainstream media in Canada, including the private broadcasters, not just the CBC, were given a $600 million subsidy in 2019 and have received a number of top-ups and extra money through various programs. And Trudeau has bought himself, specifically with this case with the men from Coots, a code of silence. The media will not talk about it. They claim to hide behind a publication ban, which the defense brought, but that publication ban was only on a narrow set of information involving the information to obtain for the warrants. But the government and the media could be asking these questions of the government. How come we have political prisoners in Canada? Why were 2 of these men kept in solitary confinement? Why were they denied bail when none of them had criminal records and they're totally upstanding citizens? Why have they been kept in jail and this trial hasn't got underway for 2 years? All of these questions are legitimate, and there's nothing stopping them from asking them, except that they don't want to bite the hand that feeds them. Trudeau has bought the media, and we live in, like, it's just incredible how much they accuse us of peddling in misinformation and disinformation. They are guilty of lying to the Canadian people by failing to report on this case.
Andrew, this failure by mainstream media to hold to the fire the feet of those responsible for what certainly seemed to be egregious acts. It's awfully familiar.
Yeah, and it is worrying if we're going to be in that sort of say, what's great about this programme is you do call things out. You do say, let's question it. It doesn't mean we've got the answers, but we have to, when you hear about these abhorrent cases and working on that sort of basis, there has to be somebody who's going to fight for the underdog. And the fact that we've had a number of cases similar to this, where basically they don't happen until you make it an ITV drama or something like that, that's nonsense. The mainstream media, we're here to always hold people's feet to the fire.
Gordon McGill, trucker, more recently commentator and citizen journalist, thanks for joining me tonight. Keep up the good work and perhaps we'll catch up again in the near future. Thank you very much. Another break, after which Canadian journalist David Craden will join me to discuss new proposed online controls for Canada, which he calls a new standalone hate crime offence on the way. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back. Thanks for staying. My next guest this evening is Canadian journalist David Craden, who joins me, and not for the first time, to talk about the new Online Harms Act being introduced in Canada. Billed as a way to address dangers that children face online, the Act also includes the introduction of stiffer penalties for so-called hate offences, stirring up hate. The bill proposes increasing the maximum punishment for advocating genocide to life imprisonment and allowing sentences of up to 5 years in prison for other hate propaganda offences. David, are you there?
I am, and I'm wearing my Think While It's Still Legal T-shirt. I usually have a tie on when I'm on your show, Neil. But this is so important to get this across to an international audience. What's happening in Canada? We are on the verge of losing freedom of speech with this Online Harms Act. I was expecting this thing to be called the Online Safety Act, like it has been called in the UK and Australia. But I think I registered my opprobrium too effectively because they changed the name of it. And they've moved from calling out misinformation and disinformation, and now they're focusing on hate speech. And even something called harm content, which I'm not quite sure what that means. But this bill, as you mentioned at the beginning, can get you life imprisonment for violating what they're calling a harm online offense. And it can get you a $70,000 fine from one of these human rights tribunals, which are going to be recharged after Stephen Harper, the former prime minister, got them out of the hate speech business. So they're going to be up doing their Spanish Inquisition again, and people will be filing complaints from stand-up comics to people on YouTube who are in any way offending them, or if it can be at all purported that they're somehow promoting these three things: hatred, violent extremism, terrorism, or violence itself. And by that definition, Neil, I would be promoting violent extremism by saying anything positive about the Freedom Convoy, because that's how Justin Trudeau described the Freedom Convoy, as misogynist, racist, Nazis, and violent extremists. Although, of course, we all know they engaged in absolutely no violence. But that's what we're up against now. This is frightening. This is a complete betrayal of 500 years of English-speaking democracy from the Magna Carta on. This is a violation of everything Canada has always been about.
David, bear with me. Andrew, this sounds very obviously, it reminds us of the online safety bill in the UK that so many of us have been and continue to be alarmed about. Where are we going? Why are one government after another in supposedly liberal societies seeking to shut down anyone who says anything they don't like the sound of.
Yes, and you're absolutely right. We need to look at that freedom of speech aspects, and it is interesting talking about the change in language, whether it's, you know, the online safety bill as opposed to the online harms act that they're talking about in Canada. But a lot of things they're trying to guard against, and they've got the list of 7 which they talk about here, which you would obviously want to stop. And the ones on things, basically anything that induces a child to harm themselves, so that sort of stuff, videos on that sort of thing, content that foments hatred. If you're looking at that sort of thing, the question is, where do you draw the line? Because you have to have a society where we can discuss things at the same time, which I like the T-shirt that he's wearing, because you're right, it's make it illegal to think, and then we've got a really big problem in society.
David, you're a journalist, you're working in Canada, but what's happening in terms of other protest in your country? Is this being protested in Parliament? Is it being protested in the mainstream media in Canada?
There has been limited pushback from the legacy media in Canada. I'm not seeing, hurrah, hurrah, we're doing something good with this bill. The Conservative opposition in the House of Commons is not taking this bill seriously, sufficiently seriously. And they have complained that it's simply, all we have to do is prosecute these evil people out there who are exploiting children. But of course, that's not what this bill is about. That's the veneer. That is how Trudeau is justifying it. And Poilievre has complained about the fact that there's this new Digital Safety Commission of Canada. And he's right about that. We've created another arm of bureaucracy. And I don't know if this is going to be a department within a department or an agency, but this is going to be effectively an online censorship bureaucracy in Canada that is going to be responsible for deciding what is hate speech and what is not. And I've always said, if you want to call Karl Marx hate speech, I think you could argue that point. But I don't want to start banning people I disagree with simply because I think they might say something that can be construed by somebody somewhere as hateful. This whole hate speech law should be anathema to democratic values, to freedom of speech.
And when you say that, when you say that, David, an anathema, from where is this attitude coming? In peaceful, peace-loving, supposedly liberal democratic societies like Canada, like New Zealand, like Australia, like the UK, what is underlying this drive now to shut down debate and freedom of speech, which is absolutely at the core of democracy as we've been trained for centuries to understand it? What's driving this?
I think it's clearly just this globalist agenda that is being driven by globalist elites who want to destroy those democratic countries, who want to see democracies like the UK, like Canada, like Australia, like New Zealand, and America die. They do not want these countries to continue to exist as bastions of freedom, because that's not what their agenda is about. It's about enslavement. It's about taking over these countries. And Trudeau is simply preaching and introducing this globalist agenda in the same way as we're seeing it in the European Parliament, as we've seen it in your country, and we see it in the United States as well. That's what is going on here. This is a diabolical law. And I don't use that term loosely. This is a very sinister attempt to control how people think and how they speak. And there's even thought crime in this bill, believe it or not, because you can be arrested for merely being suspected of perhaps saying something hateful, perhaps being guilty of harmful speech. And somebody literally can call me out for saying, I think Creighton might say something hateful in the future, so we should take him off the air. I mean, that is something right out of Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, where people used to say, the only time I felt like I could speak my mind or I could speak truth was at midnight lying in bed, because that's when I thought nobody was really listening. And that is what is so horrible about this, is it is going to force people to self-censorship.
Yeah. Andrew Eborn, again, I see you're a lawyer.
Yes.
I've always understood that when it comes to laws that affect the lives of millions of people, it has to be tied down very, very precisely. But it feels that there's this inherent ambiguity in these new legislative offerings, such that they're just open to interpretation. And should that be the case, that laws that could put people behind bars for life are just the subject of context and interpretation?
You're absolutely right. We touched on this earlier. It's the biggest problem is the label. If you look at the extreme cases, you don't want to have content that encouraging people to be violent. You don't want content encouraging people for terrorism or to self-harm. All of those things are abhorrent. The difficulty is when you apply a label. In the same way as we talked about earlier, you say someone's an extremist if they have an opposite view. And that's the real difficulty. It's about that interpretation. As a lawyer, you want to have a precise definition so that you do know that our right to freedom of speech is not going to be affected.
David Craden, just a last word from you while I still have you. Are the people of Canada, we get away from the media, get away from the politicians, are the people of Canada aware, in the way that you would like them to be aware, of the implications of this legislation?
I hope they are. It's very difficult to gauge that. There has been a tremendous amount of discussion about this bill since Monday afternoon when it was introduced on social media. There seems to be a general consensus among most journalists that this is a destructive bill, and this is not really about protecting children or making things safer for children. It's about destroying free speech. So yes, I think Canadians will rally. My concern is this bill will pass before the next election. And once bills pass, they're difficult to repeal. They tend to become vested interests.
Indeed they are. David Craden, journalist, commentator, thank you so much for this evening. We'll speak again. Another break, a final break, after which I'll be telling you all about my new show, just chewing the fat about it with Andrew Eborn here. It's all change. I'll be going online and I'll also be on your TV screen, but on another time. So much to tell you about. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Neil Oliver Live. Now, some might say it's self-indulgent, but I kind of have the feeling that it might be a good idea to tell you in advance about changes to this show. There's always a lot of interest, a lot of feedback. I see a lot of comments on social media and all of the rest of it. And I thought in advance of the changes, rather than them just suddenly appear as though through a trapdoor, we could talk it through. And Andrew's a regular contributor to this show, so I thought I could, canvass a little bit of opinion right up front. But the changes are going to come in next week. I will be appearing I'll be hosting a 2-hour show, which will go out, first of all, on a Friday online. Okay, so it will go out by, on the various apps and on YouTube and all of the rest of it, by whatever means anyone accesses that kind of content. So that'll be 2 hours. And then on a Sunday, on the following Sunday, at 6 o'clock, which is the usual time, but a different day, a 1-hour version of that show will be broadcast in the usual way. Now, for me, I'm very excited about having 2 hours again. Those with long memories might remember that I had 2 hours in the beginning and it became 1 hour. I'm very much looking forward to the opportunity to give conversations the chance to breathe, to get properly into the topic, to let people relax into a conversation. So with that as a prospect, Andrew, what do you make of the all-new Neil Oliver show?
Well, it's something that we've spoken about. Every time we finish a programme, we've always said, I've had the joy of being with every possible iteration, whether it's down in the Westminster studio or here, we've always said, I wish we had more time with this guest, because it was about to get really interesting and unpack it more. So I'm delighted that you've got 2 hours. It's also the way a lot of media is going. You need to be more platforms than Paddington, as I always say. You turn around on that sort of basis. So to get a full 2 hours of you and basically unpacking stuff, it also helps around the world, because you get different timings and so on and so forth. You've got America waking up at different times, Australia and so on and so forth. And you've got an amazing global audience. The figures you're doing on these social media platforms are just tremendous.
Yeah, and I mean, there is, it's the idea of GB News America.
Yes.
There is an offering that is being shaped and offered to that, audience of hundreds of millions
And
in
that's
the
the
United
thing, yes.
States of America. And as you say, I very much look forward to the possibility of it being determinedly pushed out to a global audience as well as to the cherished viewership here in the UK.
And it is incredible. I see the feedback to the show and the brilliant comments that people come in. And it's all over the world. So they're watching at the moment on YouTube and various other platforms, not necessarily in a linear way. So you need that sort of basis. You need to make sure that you bring Neil Oliver to the world and your voice gets heard. But also you've then got the reason to unpack. And we always say, look, people are running out of time. And how many shows have you and I sat through and said, oh, we should have had more time with this guest. It was just getting interesting.
Speaking of which, we're running out of time. That's all for this week. Big thank you to all my guests. Thanks as always to Andrew Eborn. Anytime now, stay with us. It'll be the Saturday 5, and I will see you in a new way next week.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.